hello there. I'm just getting, let's see, there.
Oh, there you are. I can see you. Hello, Paolo. How are you today?
Good. How are you doing?
Great, thank you very much. We're having our 10th anniversary here in this Gothenburg branch of the Science Fiction Bookshop in Sweden. And we're very proud of that. And we're so glad to have you here. We're so glad to have you here. Your first novel has been a huge success here, actually, and I personally think it's one of my favorite books of the last few years. But why don't we start from the beginning? Could you tell us a little bit about your background? Where'd you come from? How did you get into writing?
Sure. My background, originally, I live in a very small town in the rural part of the United States, western Colorado, out in the mountains, sort of. And I grew up, my family were hippies. They moved out to live off the land, grow organic apples,
right.
You know, be very natural. And so I actually didn't think I was going to be a writer originally. I actually was very much hoping to sort of escape my hippie family's roots and get into business and make money, and I don't know. But in the end, I tried working in business. My background, when I went to college, I studied Chinese language, and then I moved over to China and worked there. And I didn't enjoy it. And so I eventually ended up, sort of giving up on the idea of doing business. I tried business. I tried doing work in programming as well, web development, things like that. And even though I could make money doing those things, I wasn't very satisfied doing those things. And so I ended up writing mostly to escape that, actually. I would write on the weekends, and it was something that I could do to sort of feel like I had something of my own, and something that I had control over.
Right.
And then it just kind of kept going. And
how did you get into science fiction to begin with? Were you always, did you always want to write science fiction from the beginning?
I did. My father was a big science fiction reader, actually, and his father as well. And so I remember the first science fiction book I read was Citizen of the Galaxy by Robert Heinlein, and it was my grandfather's copy, actually, of the book.
Wow.
And yeah, and
amazing.
And it was the first book that I really enjoyed reading. I remember it was the first big book that I read, you know, and I must have been in third grade, so I must have been about 10 or something like that. And I remember being very excited because it was the first big thing that I'd read. It had 300 pages in it, I remember very clearly, and yeah. I felt very proud of myself. But that was the first story I really enjoyed, and that really sort of took me away. And from that moment on, I was a science fiction reader, and so I read all of my father's science fiction, and then my mother had a boyfriend, and he had a huge science fiction collection as well, and at one point he just sort of bequeathed it all to me, and so I ended up with hundreds and hundreds of other science fiction books that I read as well, and so that was really my introduction to reading, and really for a long time, all the way up until, you know, well into college, I think it was pretty much all I read.
That's interesting about the Citizens of the Galaxy, because you can really tell that in Shipbreaker, that really has a lot of the Heinlein juvenile feel to it, although, of course, I mean, the background's completely different. It's a completely different world, but the story is sort of similar. It's an adventure story with, you know, a boy who grows up poor, yeah. and has adventures and saves the princess and what have you. And
absolutely. And I was actually consciously trying to emulate a lot of what Heinlein did. I was really interested in the idea of the boy who learned better story.
Yeah. Right.
And that was, I remembered it being a very powerful thing for me as a kid when I was reading, and I remember that that was what hooked me to reading, was that sort of a storyline. And my wife is a school teacher, and she's been having a lot of difficulty getting mostly her boys to read, and so I started going through all of my science fiction collection saying, well, how can they not like reading? I've got all these great books. And I started pulling them off the shelves and started reading them myself, and they all felt old. They all felt dated. They all felt very 1950s, 1960s, that kind of sort of thing. And so it was sort of heartbreaking, because it sort of felt like all the things that I treasured, in terms of the idea of handing a lot of them on, it wasn't really something that you could hand on to a new kid and say, here, try this. This is going to be cool for you. And so I decided to write Shipbreaker partly because of that. I wanted to sort of revive a lot of the things that I loved and that had gotten me both reading science fiction. And I wanted to update that and make it relevant to today, and relevant to the ideas that I think are sort of shaping our future.
Right. But we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves here. I mean, your early stories are nothing like that. They're not exactly adventure stories. So what were some of your influences when you started writing your early science fiction?
Honestly, I think it probably was a combination. In my very earliest stuff, for example, when I wrote something like Pocketful of Dharma, which was a short story that came out back in 1999, I think probably the two biggest influences were probably William Gibson and Cormac McCarthy.
Oh, really? Okay.
And they, stylistically, they were really interesting to me. William Gibson had that lush sort of just ability to evoke a complete and total world, and that I was always quite enamored with it. And cyberpunk had been a huge influence for me. And in fact, when I wrote that story initially, somebody read it and said, "Oh yeah, this is a great story, except for cyberpunk is dead."
Right.
So you need to revise this in some way to actually make it seem somehow fresh instead of completely derivative. And but Gibson was huge. Neil Stephenson was huge. People like that they were the ones who I was reading right as I was actively trying to become a writer. Once I'd crossed over from sort of thinking that I was doing it as a hobby to really trying to make something happen, those were the kinds of people I was reading.
The beginning of your career is sort of reminiscent of the beginning of William Gibson's career. I mean, you have a couple of stories that are well received, but they're not making a huge splash. And some of the stories seem to take place in the same world, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes the big novel that is like the first novel of the year, and it scoops up all the awards and so on. So tell me, how did that happen? You have a couple of stories, and then comes the novel. How did that happen? Which came first?
The story. Well, what happened? The background. There's some other background for me as a writer. It might look a little bit like I came out of nowhere, but there was a period where I was writing novels and they were all getting rejected. I have 4 novels that I wrote that I'm somewhat grateful now that they were rejected. But but there's a lot of trunk work that happened, and at some point I sort of despaired of ever being a successful novelist, and so I started writing short stories. And one of those short stories, as I was writing it, I was having a hard time with it, because I knew I wanted to write a short story I wanted to write a novelette, something around 10 or 11,000 words, not too big. And I kept writing it and I kept rewriting it, and it was just really hard to work with, and I couldn't figure out why. And I showed it to a friend of mine, and she read it and she says, "Wow, this is really great, but it's packed. It's just packed." And she said, "It feels like you're working with a dwarf star or something. There's so much material in here. You've got 3 different characters, all with their different points of view, and you're trying to make this thing and this plot happen." And she's like, "I think you're working on a novel." And I was horrified. I thought, I don't want to write any more novels. I know what happens when I try to write a novel. It means I spend a year and a half working on something, and then it gets rejected, and then I'm heartbroken. And so I thought, I'm not working on a novel. There's no way I'm working on a novel. And so what I did was I took that Dwarf Star and I started writing short stories out of it. And one of those became The Calorie Man. Another one became Yellow Card Man. And what I would do is I would take one little piece. I'd take a component of the world and I'd write some about that. Or I'd take one of the characters that I thought was interesting and I'd write some of that character's backstory. And for a long time, actually, I thought that was all I was going to do with that, was I would just keep pulling out little threads from the ball of yarn, and just use those, and that way I could at least be writing, but I wouldn't have to commit to a novel. And then my ego got involved, and somehow, people kept asking me if I was ever going to write a novel, if I would try again, and I think there were a bunch of different things that all happened at once, but suddenly I started thinking, well, if I was going to try to write a novel, this is clearly the thing to do it with, because there's so much here, and it's big and it's gnarly and it's scary, but there's a lot to work with, and so I did start on it then. So it's sort of this strange thing that it just sort of there was sitting there for a long time as an idea. Composite, I guess, and then later on managed to turn it into the actual book, The Wind-Up Girl. But that took, working on The Wind-Up Girl, I think took me more than 2 or 3 years, so it was slow.
Okay. So was it a big surprise to you that it was as successful as it has been?
Oh yes, it's very humbling. Because I think part of me, for a long time I thought a few people liked my writing, but not many people liked my writing, and so I thought when I wrote a novel that it would be the same kind of response, that there would be a few very supportive people, and then most people would dismiss it. And certainly when all of the major publishing houses here in the United States rejected the book, that sort of confirmed my expectations about what would happen. If I hadn't been very lucky, and if Nightshade Books, a small press out of San Francisco, hadn't bought the book, I think it would have just gone into the drawer with all my other books. And so then seeing it come out, and then seeing it start to get attention and start to get good reviews and then start to win awards, I sort of kept looking over my shoulder and wondering, how is this happening, and how this doesn't seem right. It seems like somebody chose the wrong book and they just don't know it yet. So it's been, it's both exhilarating and also scary, because it doesn't really feel like it's something that's inside of your control.
It is a sort of unlikely science fiction success, because that sort of story, the near future, if this goes on story, almost like a dystopia, it used to be quite a big part of science fiction back in the 1960s, 1970s, maybe the 80s, but for the last 20 years or so that's been very unusual. There are stories like that written, but they're usually not very popular. Most popular science fiction these days is, it's space opera, or it's far future.
Right.
So why do you think that is, and why do you think that your novel is an exception?
I don't know, honestly. I think I have some ideas. I think it's possible. And this is just me talking. I don't. But I think that in some ways science fiction moved away from a certain immediacy. I feel like it followed some certain specific extrapolations very, very successfully. It followed sort of the changes in computer technology and computing technology. It followed out the ideas of space travel and aeronautical engineering. And it sort of walked away, I think, from a whole other range of concerns and ideas. And I think that partly what's going on is that the Wind-Up Girl resonates with the zeitgeist right now.
Yeah.
Because of food politics, because of the way that large agricultural corporations already work, because the food movement is big now, and I think that it's a story. It is a story for the food movements. If you're interested in slow food, then the Wind-Up Girl is going to carry a certain amount of resonance, and I think because of that. The Wind-Up Girl, despite being depressing, despite being, a bunch of things that we think of as not being very sellable, I think it touches that a certain set of current fears, and that relevance is what's actually driving it. That's my best guess.
Yeah. The smart thing after a success like that would be, career-wise, obviously to write a sequel to it, or at least something very similar, but you didn't. You went and wrote a young adult novel instead.
Right.
Can you tell me how that happened?
I actually wrote both books simultaneously. I was writing Wind-Up Girl and Shipbreaker at the same time. We see Shipbreaker coming out later because of publishing schedules. Nightshade, my adult publisher moved a lot faster than my young adult publisher did. But it's a lot of it actually has to do with I sort of have changed some of my focus as well, and there are some things that I've gotten a lot of criticism, and I was getting a lot of criticism for my short stories because they were so depressing, and I'd been thinking about that. I was thinking about how I would go about writing something that struck a more positive note, or what a more positive story might feel like in any way. And one of the things I concluded was that I don't feel comfortable writing extremely positive stories for adults. I like my stories to be unsettling for adults, because I feel like we as adults are responsible for doing a lot of very ugly things, and I don't want us to have a sense of safety. For children, that's a different thing. I feel like children have potential to still make better choices than we make, and so giving them a story where there's a success or a win or a happy ending it feels better to me. And to be honest, I depress myself when I'm writing, and so I was looking for some way to write something that felt a little more upbeat than what I normally do, and the only way to do that really was to write for young adults. And so it's sort of a balance for me, where I can write on one side, I can write with the intensity that I'm sort of feeling a lot of things right now about, and on another level I can still go and have some fun with writing, because otherwise I feel burned out and just too depressed. And so that's part of what's going on. But to be honest, right now, very strangely, most of my ideas right now are more stories for young adults. That seems to actually really be doing something for me right now. And so yeah, I'm not sure if that's a good idea career-wise, but it's satisfying creatively, so I like it.
Yeah, that's important. I read that you were working on what you call the companion piece, I think, to Shipbreaker, not a sequel. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're working on currently?
Yeah, I'm just finishing it up, actually. I've got another week and a half to work on it, and then they're taking it away from me, and I can't play with it anymore, and they're just going to cut me off.
Tell me about it.
That story is, it's about a pair of war orphans who are living on the outskirts of a place called the Drowned Cities. And the Drowned Cities are a part of the United States that have been sort of embroiled in a perpetual war for a long time. They've been fighting for so long that it's devolved down to the point where it's mostly children doing the fighting. Adults direct the fighting, but it's mostly children who are doing the fighting. And there are a lot of different factions, and they all are sort of fighting for their patriotic ideals. And so the story really focuses on these two kids who tried to escape from the fighting and are living out on the outskirts of the Drowned Cities. And they're doing fine until this half-man named Tool, who is a character in Shipbreaker as well, right, shows up and sort of crashes into their lives, and he's pursued by soldiers, and his arrival brings the war onto the children's doorstep and sort of drags them back into everything. Overall, it's a story that started because I've been thinking a lot about how American politics has been devolving, and how the rhetoric has gotten very acid, very, very negative, and you see a lot of people starting to question whether or not who's a real American or who's a patriot or a good person or and I think that turn really started right after 9/11, but I feel like it just keeps kind of going, and there's this more and more, there's this willingness to vilify our opponents, and so the story sort of grew out of that question of, well, if our political dialogue continues to devolve in this way, where are we taking this place? Where are we taking our country exactly? And so I wanted to sort of play with some of that. It's actually I was a little frustrated with the story because it turned out to be darker than I had originally intended, just because some of the topics that ended up getting involved in it, the child warfare and things like that, made it a much more intense story than I had intended, and there just wasn't any way to be honest with the material without also ending up being in a darker place than I expected. So.
But it's still a good adventure yarn, is it?
I think it is. A bunch of people have been reading it, and apparently I'm far more depressed by it than anyone else is. So I'm not sure why this is. My wife just read it, and some other people have read it. My editor's very excited about it. And they feel like it's a better book than Shipbreaker. They feel like it's actually significantly better and more gripping and more engaging, and they did like it better, and I was surprised by that, because I sort of expected when I handed it over to them that they'd throw it back in my face, and instead there's been a lot of excitement about it, and so it's possible that I just don't know how to judge my own work.
When I was reading Shipbreaker, I kept guessing, is this supposed to be the same future as The Wind-Up Girl? Because there's some of the same technologies and some of the same problems, but it's... it's not intended to be. It's essentially, it's more of a simplified version of it. Yep. And same concerns, absolutely. It's the same sort of global warming, peak oil, everything falls apart sort of set of ideas. But no, I don't think of them as the same world at all. I think of them as having separate history lines. If they were, they could be one alternate universe over from each other, but the Shipbreaker universe really doesn't have any of that food politics, any of that genetic engineering stuff in the same way that the way that Shipbreaker explores those things. And so, no, they're different worlds. But yeah, representative of my own obsessions that I keep sort of circling back to. Sure. So are there more adult stories, adult novels coming along as well, or are you concentrating on young adult?
There's a possibility that the next adult story I write will actually be fantasy.
Interesting.
Yeah, because, I have to just, keep veering around or something. I'm not sure. I'm interested. I wrote a novella recently with a friend of mine, Tobias Bakel, and it was an attempt to use fantasy as a way of talking about certain environmental ideas.
The Alchemist.
Yes, The Alchemist. Yeah.
Haven't read it, but I've seen it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and it doesn't. It's sort of a way to play with some of the ideas that I think are important, but without all of the political baggage that comes when you say global warming. And especially, here in the United States, you say global warming, and that just means you're a Democrat, which means you're a traitor, which means you're, you have that sort of a, and so I want to talk about larger environmental concepts, but move that into a metaphorical space that maybe makes it more accessible to people who would otherwise just sort of put up blinders and try to ignore. And so I like the world that we built, and that world is all sort of predicated around the idea that when people use magic, there's a poisonous vine called bramble with thorns on it, and it causes a sleeping sickness when you touch it, and it's very much the classic fairy tale, Sleeping Beauty, thorns sort of bramble, but it grows whenever anybody uses any magic, but it never grows in your house. It always grows over in some farmer's field far away. It always grows in your neighbor's roof beams. It always grows somewhere else other than on you, so you have that quality of having the immediate benefit of having used magic, but the cost is distributed out to the society, and that's and that's the classic conundrum of all environmental problems, is that when we drive our car, we get where we wanted to go, and the rest of society pays. So I'm interested in playing with that sort of a metaphor and those ideas some more. So
that's interesting. Okay, maybe we should.
Sorry.
Maybe we should see if we have any questions from the audience here. We have a couple of people here. We have one here.
No pressure.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
It's really warm here, so tropical summer in Sweden.
Oh, okay.
I've been asking this same question to all the authors so far, so I thought I wouldn't ruin it and not ask you. So the question is, if you could design a T-shirt with a slogan or a quote or something, what would it say?
Wow, that's a really interesting question.
Isn't it though?
And you put me on the spot here. So, if you were encapsulating, if you were encapsulating sort of my fiction overall, I think that the T-shirt would say something like, "We're doing very bad things." If it was just a T-shirt for me, though, for me, it would have a picture of a gummy bear, because that's my favorite candy.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Johan has already asked you quite a lot about your upcoming fiction, but I, for one, is very interested to know what happened in Finland.
What happened in Finland? It's off stage. You don't get to know.
No. But I would love to. If you want to write that book, I would definitely read it.
That would be the one that you'd be interested in.
Well, several, but since you mention it all the time, again and again and again,
right.
I really need to know what happened in Finland.
Maybe I could write a short story about that. That might be an interesting way to sort of explore it. And yeah, but I very deliberately wanted to sort of leave that in your imagination as something horrible going down, but not explicitly named, and that which should not be told, sort of. But yeah, I think if I write a direct sequel ever to Wind Up Girl, it's possible that the story that I would actually pursue is the one about Tan Hock Seng and the girl Mai, and also Richard Carlyle, the guy who runs the dirigible companies. And I think I would move the story to India because I'm still interested in the idea of writing about a country that's completely sort of swallowed up by the calorie companies, and describing that. If Thailand was the country that fought things off, then what does India look like when it's completely swallowed up? And so, and besides that, my wife is Indian, and so I have family in India, so it's a good excuse to go visit.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One thing that always interests me is the writing process. How would you describe your writing process? Do you write by hand, first draft, or?
No, I write it by computer. And what I do normally is I actually spend a lot of time. I'm still figuring out my writing process because sometimes I think that I've finally figured it all out and it's all perfect and everything's very simple now, and next book is going to be very easy, and it never is. So, but what I've found is that a lot of times what I'm trying to do is that I will write. I think I can hear some farm equipment driving by here. Sorry. What I try to do is when I'm. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear fine.
Okay, sorry, there's these tractors that are driving by right outside my window. What I try to do is I'm trying to find some seed of the story that feels like it's real to me. And so I'll write scenes and characters, and I'll try to tell the story, and I'll write a couple of chapters normally. I'll write, oftentimes I'll write 10, 15, 20,000 words where I'm trying to write a certain character, what they're doing, what they're up to, and then it won't feel right, and so then I'll throw all of that away, and I'll start it over again, and I'll try a different line. I'll try it with a new character. Maybe there's something that's more interesting that I figured out about the character as I was going, and I'll try to write about the character in that way instead, and I keep sort of circling around the characters and the storyline that they're doing, and I worry about the world and whether or not the world seems real, because at first it always feels fake to me. You're just kind of making things up, and you're very conscious of making things up, and it all feels like lies at first. And so what I'm trying to do is get to that point where in those continual revisions where I write some and I throw it all away, and then I write it again a little better and I throw it all away, is I'm looking for some moment where suddenly the world and the characters all seem absolute, that suddenly they seem so real and so true that I can keep going with them, and that I know that the next time they're in a conversation, I know how they'll respond, and that I know that the next thing around the corner will look like this. When they arrive at the next city, it'll look this way because it's built in my head finally. But a lot of times that takes me a very long time, and so I'll write. With short stories, I'll write entire drafts of short stories and then throw them away and start over again, and then write them out in a completely different way and then throw that away, and then finally I'll come up with something and say, oh right, this is of course the way it should be, and then it writes very quickly. And for something like The Drowned Cities, my most recent book, it's been very much like that, where not only did I write an entire novel that I threw away, actually, I wrote 90,000 words and then threw everything away because it was wrong. But then
you don't try to salvage anything out of
I didn't. It was I finally realized that it was all lies, that it wasn't working, but there was one little piece of it that was really interesting to me, and so I took that little piece and started writing the entire story again around that instead, and it meant I made up new characters for it. It meant I changed the setting for it. I changed everything. But I don't think I would have found that idea if I hadn't written this entire terrible book first. So it's a lot of try-fail for me is the way it normally works. I do something, it's wrong, I try it again, I try it again, I tried it again, and then at some point it really does work. And with this last book, what that meant was that I'd been working on it for more than a year and a half, probably a year and a half, with just, all these false starts and all this trouble and everything, and then suddenly it was right and it was correct, and I wrote the next draft in 4 months and it was done, and it was there and it was right. Because I finally understood it, and I think I finally understood my own head well enough that I could finally tell the story that needed to be told. But it's a muddy process for me. I'm very bad at it. I'm not one of those people who writes out a complete plot and then just writes the plot. Whenever I've done that or tried to do that, it always ends up being a false start, and I end up throwing it all away.
So you discovered the story as you go along?
Yes, very much. Yeah, and I think that my best skill actually is that process of writing something very bad and then seeing the one decent thing inside of it, and then being willing to go after that completely and going after the one decent thing. And I feel like almost all the really good stories that I've written have come out that way, where it was done wrong first and then refound, essentially.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, yeah.
Hi again. I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Since you are now in the spotlight in many ways, how do you feel about fan fiction?
How do I feel about it?
Yes, you are going to be subject to it within, if you haven't already been, you are going to. People are going to pick up characters, are going to pick up the world and write stuff about it.
I obviously I can't really read it because that would open me up to certain legal problems down the road, potentially open those up, and so I can't really read it. So I actually, it's pretty abstract to me one way or the other. It's interesting because when I was a kid, actually, I really liked to sort of write about essentially very much related worlds to the things that I'd been reading. I remember trying to write about stuff like Anne McCaffrey's Dragons, stuff like that. And so I understand the impulse a lot. And in fact, there was one point when I was sort of starving as a writer, and I thought, God, if only I could write some Star Wars novels. Like, I could totally, and so the impulse to live inside of a world that's rich and existent, in some ways, now as an author, to hear that somebody might be interested in doing that, it's actually quite flattering, because it means that your world actually exists. From the perspective of doing something creative, I think that there's definitely a point where you also want to say, that's really cool that somebody wants to do that, but you also want to encourage them to do more and to build their own world and to take that to the next level, because that's where, at least for me, it's all the payoff has actually been is in that moment when you take ownership over something completely. But yeah, it's a sort of a mixed set of feelings, because in some ways it's very flattering that somebody would even consider it. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're about to round this up. I was going to ask as a final question what if you have a title for your next novel, but I think you just answered it. It's The Drowned Cities, right?
Yes, it's The Drowned Cities, and at this point the publishing company has committed to that, so I don't think they're going to let me change it anymore.
There you go. All right. Yeah. Best of luck with that and with your future writing. And I'm so happy to have had you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and congratulations on your anniversary as well.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.